Welcome. My name is Dave Bowden, the news editor here at Ballotpedia. Over the past 2 months, we've all seen the effect that the coronavirus pandemic has had on political and civic life. And I think it's pretty safe to say this is one of those events that has directly affected everyone. This includes, but isn't limited to, directives issued by government officials to either close schools or certain businesses, the implementation of social distancing, closures of government offices such as judicial and other proceedings, and the like. There's just been so many different effects. And politically, this outbreak has also affected elections for all offices, from the presidency right on down to municipal officials. I hope you're able to join us last month for our briefing, which provided an overview of so many of the effects of coronavirus. The recording of that session is up on our website. In this webinar, we want to go into detail about how the pandemic has affected a subject that we regularly pay so much attention to at Ballotpedia, and that is elections. And so we're going to go into detail about the changes that have occurred to election dates, to voting, and so forth. And I'll have to admit, it's a subject that's still changing, but hopefully there won't be more changes that are happening while we're here talking with you now. So joining me to look at this topic is Jarek Adams, who is a staff writer at Ballotpedia, and he's also the primary author of our Ballot Bulletin newsletter, which focuses on voting and election policy. So Jarek, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
All right, we have a lot of material to get to, so let's just dive right in. So here at Ballotpedia, we've been tracking the effects of COVID-19 on election administration pretty much from day one. So Jared, kind of broadly speaking, what types of modifications have states made to their elections in light of this outbreak?
Not surprisingly, the states have taken a variety of actions in this area. For our tracking purposes, we've grouped these actions into three distinct categories. The first is election date postponements, the second is changes to candidate filing procedures, and the third is changes to absentee and mail-in voting procedures.
All right, so let's start with the election date postponements. And these tend to generate a lot of media attention. For example, just last week, I know Delaware postponed its presidential primary to July 7th, and that marked the second postponement of this primary. Is that correct?
That's correct. So Delaware's presidential primary was originally scheduled to take place on April 28th. On March 23rd, Governor John Carney first postponed the primary to June 2nd. Then, as you just noted, Carney postponed the primary a second time, so it's now scheduled to take place on July 7th.
All right, that's interesting. Have there been any other states that have made these kind of secondary postponements like Delaware has?
A few states have, as a matter of fact. Connecticut's presidential primary was originally scheduled to take place on April 28th. It was first postponed to June 2nd, and then it was postponed further, this time to August 11th. Georgia's presidential primary was originally scheduled for March 24th. It was first postponed to May 19th, the same date as the statewide primary. Both the presidential and statewide primaries were then subsequently postponed to June 9th. And Louisiana's presidential primary was scheduled to take place on April 4th. It was first postponed to June 20th, then postponed again to July 11th.
That's very interesting. And of course, some states have two separate primaries this year because it's a presidential election year. So they have maybe a date for their presidential primary, and they also have a date for their statewide primary. So there's even more elections that we're talking about in this universe. Altogether, how many states have postponed their elections in response to this coronavirus outbreak?
To date, we've tracked 20 states that have postponed elections for state-level offices. That includes 8 states that have postponed presidential and statewide primaries: Georgia, Indiana, Kentucky, Maryland, New Jersey, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. We have 5 states that have postponed presidential primaries. That's Connecticut, Delaware, Louisiana, New York, and Rhode Island. We have another 2 states that have postponed statewide primaries, their presidential primaries already having taken place. That's Maine and Virginia. And finally, we have 5 states that have postponed special or runoff elections. This includes Alabama, Massachusetts, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Texas.
Wow, that is a lot of states, and obviously they were all highlighted on that map on that last slide. Given the number of postponements, have any elections gone on as scheduled since this outbreak began?
Generally speaking, no, but Wisconsin is a noteworthy exception. Its presidential primary and spring election took place as scheduled on April 7th.
Yeah, there was a ton of media coverage about that, including attempts or efforts to postpone the election. Can you give us a little bit more detail about what happened in Wisconsin?
Definitely. So on April 6th, the day before the election, the governor issued an executive order to postpone in-person voting to June 9th and extend the receipt deadline for absentee ballots to June 9th. Republican leaders in the state legislature alleged that the governor, a Democrat, had exceeded his authority in postponing the election. They then filed suit in the state Supreme Court, which later that day voted 4-2 in their favor, staying the governor's order. This allowed the election to take place as scheduled on April 7th.
Yeah, and we covered that pretty extensively. That's a great summary. We covered that whole election pretty extensively, and there were some pretty fascinating pictures, that were on social media or in the news media or whatever, in Wisconsin on the day of the election. There was obviously people adhering to social distancing at polling sites. There were poll workers that were wearing personal protective equipment. And I also remember too that there was some discussion, some speculation that allowing the in-person voting to proceed as planned on April 7th might cause a spike in COVID-19 cases. Have we seen any data about that last point?
So most recently, just last week actually, I read a preliminary report from some researchers at Stanford University and the University of Hong Kong. That report suggested there had been no detectable spike in cases resulting from the April 7th election. But it's worth noting that this was a pre-publication work, which means that it had not yet been subject to peer review. And I would also want to stress that there have been a lot of conflicting reports on this point.
Yeah, that makes sense. It'll definitely be something that will be studied and watched. It was a really interesting situation. All right. Moving over from election date changes to another subject that has obviously been talked about a lot in the media, and that is absentee and mail-in voting procedures. So specifically, how many states have modified their mail-in voting procedures in response to the coronavirus outbreak?
So today, well, the map on this slide shows 26 states that have made some temporary modifications to their absentee and mail-in voting procedures. These fall into 4 broad categories. In the first, we've seen 12 states that have opted to deliver absentee or mail-in ballot applications to all eligible voters in some elections. These states include Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, Idaho, Iowa, Michigan, Nebraska, New York, North Dakota, Rhode Island, South Dakota, and West Virginia. In another 5 states, officials have chosen to deliver absentee ballots themselves to all eligible voters in certain elections. These states include California, Maryland, Montana, Nevada, and New Jersey. In another 7 states, we've seen expanded eligibility provisions for absentee and mail-in voting. These states include Indiana, Kentucky, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, Texas, and Virginia. Finally, in another 2 states, we've seen extended absentee or mail-in voting deadlines. These states are Ohio and Wisconsin. I should also mention that just before I hopped on this call, I was doing a news check and saw that there's been some legislation signed into law in South Carolina that I think is providing for expanded absentee voting eligibility. So that's something that we'll be covering and adding to our content in the next day.
Awesome. I mean, that's a lot of states. So you said 26. It's obviously more than half. And I noticed you made a distinction in the first 2 categories. And this is a question I get frequently from my friends and family members that know that I work for Ballotpedia. There is a difference between delivering a mail-in ballot to all voters and delivering an application for mail-in ballot to all voters. Can you say a little bit more about that distinction?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a very subtle distinction, but a very important one. In the 12 states that have opted to transmit mail-in ballot applications to all voters, the voters have to complete those applications and then return them to state or local election officials before they receive actual ballots. In the 5 states that are delivering the ballots themselves, no action is required on the part of the individual voter to obtain the ballot. The voter just automatically receives it.
Got it. All right. Thank you for elaborating on that a little bit. Whenever my family members call, I have to kind of check our own maps and make sure that I'm giving them the right information. Now, I'm assuming that these modifications that you're talking about are more or less exclusively applying to these primaries and the special elections that are going on now. Is that right?
For the most part, yes. There are, however, a couple of noteworthy exceptions. Earlier this month, Connecticut Secretary of State Denise Merrill unveiled a plan for conducting both the state's primary and general elections. As part of that plan, election officials are going to deliver mail-in ballot applications automatically to all voters in advance of both the August 11th primary and the November 3rd general elections. Late last week, California Governor Gavin Newsom signed an executive order directing county election officials to deliver mail-in ballot applications automatically to all voters in the November 3rd general election.
All right, that's very interesting, because obviously what that suggests is that the effects of this outbreak are going to be felt on our elections, at least in some states, throughout the 2020 election cycle.
Exactly. It's too soon to tell, of course, just how many states will extend absentee and mail-in voting modifications to the general election in the fall. But with Connecticut and California having taken these actions, it's guaranteed that at least some states will.
All right, very interesting. All right, so we've talked a little bit about election date changes. We've talked about changes to voting procedures. And now let's kind of move over to another area that maybe doesn't receive as much attention in the traditional media, because it really focuses on the candidates themselves. But it's especially important to us here at Ballotpedia, and that is candidate filing procedures. So what kinds of adjustments have we seen states make to these procedures for filing for office by candidates?
So we've tracked at least 14 states in which either election officials or courts have made significant modifications to candidate filing procedures in response to the outbreak. Broadly speaking, these fall into 3 categories. The first is extensions of filing deadlines. We've seen at least 8 states that have extended candidate filing deadlines. That includes Connecticut, Georgia, Illinois, Maine, Massachusetts, Michigan, New Jersey, and Texas. We've also seen at least 8 states that have reduced petition signature requirements for at least some candidates. These states include Connecticut, Illinois, Massachusetts, Michigan, New York, Vermont, Virginia, and Washington. In at least 6 states, we've seen allowances being made for electronic document transmission and signature gathering. These states include Florida, Illinois, Massachusetts, Michigan, New Jersey, and Utah. In all of these states, with the exception of Florida, candidates have been authorized to collect petition signatures electronically, although I would note that the specific processes and requirements vary widely from state to state on that particular point.
Got it. All right, that's really interesting stuff. And like I said, it's really fascinating to those of us here at Ballotpedia that are trying to keep track of all these candidates. To somebody who maybe is not really intimately involved with all of those procedures that need to happen when somebody is trying to get on the ballot as a candidate, can you dig a little bit into one of these states a little bit more deeply and tell us kind of more specifically what has changed?
Absolutely. So Michigan is an interesting case in point. On April 20th, a federal district court judge issued an order that modified candidate filing procedures for select primary candidates. The judge ordered that petition signature requirements be reduced to 50% of their statutory amounts. He also postponed the filing deadline from April 21st to May 8th and directed election officials to develop procedures allowing for the collection and submission of electronic petition signatures. The order applied only to candidates for offices without a filing fee option. So that included candidates for the United States Senate, the U.S. House, and state judicial office. The order did not apply to state legislative candidates who can obtain ballot access by paying a filing fee in lieu of submitting petition signatures.
All right, but I understand that the state appealed that decision, correct? And then the appeals court eventually ruled in the state's favor?
That's correct, and this is where it gets a little complicated. So on May 5th, the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit ruled that the district court judge had exceeded his authority in mandating the new requirements. The appeals court did, however, agree with the judge's finding that the original requirements were unconstitutionally burdensome in light of the outbreak. The appeals court then directed officials to come up with their own modifications in consultation with the lower court. On May 8th, the state announced that it would just go ahead and adhere to the modifications laid out in the district court's original ruling, citing the lack of time remaining to make further modifications.
That's fascinating, and I'm a little bit complex, obviously, and it kind of brings up a different point, and that is, it seems that in a lot of cases with these modified procedures for candidate filing, these are happening as a result of either lawsuits or court orders. Is that the case?
That is right. Of the states that I mentioned just a few moments ago, 4 have modified their candidate filing procedures as a result of court orders. That's Illinois, Massachusetts, Michigan, and Virginia.
Which I think naturally segues to another topic that popped into my head, and that is the whole concept of lawsuits and essentially the litigation that's happening around some of these changes. There seems to have been, at least to casual reviewing of the media, an uptick in the number of lawsuits that have been filed over the various state actions that have been undertaken in response to what's been happening and to the outbreak itself. Are we seeing a lot of litigation activity involving specifically election administration?
We definitely are. To date, we've tracked at least 50 relevant lawsuits spanning 25 different states. And I would stress that this at the moment is only a partial inventory. We expect there are many more relevant lawsuits being pursued throughout the country. And our goal over the coming weeks and months is to capture and document as many of those as possible.
That's really interesting. So what kinds of issues do these lawsuits address? I mean, are they predominantly related to what we were talking about before, which is ballot access?
That was certainly the case earlier on, just within the first month of the current situation. But at this point, we're seeing a real broadening of topics. At this point, we're seeing suits that center on absentee and mail-in voting protocols, ballot access for candidates, availability of in-person voting sites, and many other issues.
All right, I'm going to put you on the spot here. I know it can be difficult to identify and isolate, specific trends, especially as you noted that we're pretty early on in this process. But can you tell us a little bit more in a little bit more detail about a couple of the lawsuits that you yourself have found particularly interesting?
Oh, sure, I'd be glad to. So there are 2 lawsuits in this area that have captured my attention in the course of the last few weeks. The first one I'll talk about is a lawsuit out of New York, Yang versus the New York State Board of Elections. On April 27th, the State Board of Elections moved to cancel the Democratic presidential primary, taking advantage of a recently enacted law that authorized the State Board of Elections to remove candidates from the ballot upon the suspension or termination of their campaigns. Andrew Yang, the former presidential candidate, and several candidates for New York's delegation to the Democratic National Convention filed suit in federal district court. They alleged that the cancellation infringed upon their rights under the First and 14th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. On May 5th, the court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs and ordered the state to reinstate the primary, which is scheduled now to take place on June 23rd. The state has appealed the decision, and a decision by the appeals court is pending.
It will be very interesting to see how all of that plays out. And I live in the New York media market, so it's definitely been a topic of conversation on the news. Really fascinating stuff. All right, you mentioned that there was a second case you could take a look at.
Yeah, absolutely. And this one has received a little less in the way of broad national media attention, but I find it pretty fascinating. This one's out of Oklahoma, League of Women Voters of Oklahoma versus Zeriax. It's a prime example of the occasional back and forth that we witness between the judiciary and the legislative branches in cases like this. On May 4th, the state Supreme Court struck down a state requirement that absentee ballots be notarized. The High Court held that this requirement did not qualify as an exception under a state law establishing that statements signed and dated under the penalty of perjury carry the force of an affidavit. The court ruled 6-3 on the matter, and the ruling applied broadly, which is to say that its effect wasn't restricted only to this election cycle. Within days, the state legislature adopted and the governor signed into law a bill that reinstated the absentee ballot notarization requirement. The legislation did include some temporary provisions that apply only to the 2020 election cycle. It permits voters to submit copies of their ID in lieu of fulfilling the notarization requirement if there's a state of emergency occurring within the state within 45 days of the scheduled election. The bill also specifies that individuals experiencing symptoms that are indicative of COVID-19 and individuals who are considered vulnerable to infection can cast absentee ballots under the physical incapacitation eligibility criterion.
That is very interesting. And again, another one that I think we'll be curious to see how that plays out. I imagine we can expect to see more lawsuits like this as the cycle wears on.
I think so, without a doubt, and we'll definitely be keeping an eye out for them.
All right, so Derek, one final question. Based on what we've seen over the last few months, what kinds of further modifications do you expect we might see as we move from the primary season, which has been kind of delayed, of course, but we're still kind of in the middle of it, and we move towards the general election in November?
So it's a little tough to say. I mean, the last few months, as you're well aware, have been a case study in thwarted expectations. But with that being said, I wouldn't be surprised at all if we see additional states that extend absentee and mail-in voting provisions into the general election season, as both Connecticut and California have already done. I think we can also expect to see, or I would not be surprised to see, additional expansions of eligibility for absentee and mail-in voting. I think we'll see an increased number of lawsuits. That number will just continue to tick upwards. And I think it's even possible that we could see some further postponements, just depending on the course the pandemic takes as the year wears on.
That's very, very good insights and great observations. So thank you. This has been an in-depth look at the changes that have been made in administration of elections in response to the COVID-19 outbreak. And we've been covering them extensively here at Ballotpedia. So thank you so much, Derek, for joining me today to talk about this.
Absolutely, it was my pleasure.
All right, so we've talked a lot today about the administration of elections, which naturally informs our coverage of the elections themselves. And looking ahead, the next statewide primary on the calendar is in Oregon, which is set to take place as scheduled on May 19th. And of course, they do all mail voting. And barring any further changes to the calendar, as we've talked about, it's not going to be too long before we come up to what I have seen some people in my social media feed referring to as Super June's Day, which is June 2nd. There's a ton of elections that are scheduled for that day. So you can stay in the know about not just elections, but all of the political news by regularly visiting ballotpedia.org. And right now we have not one, but two newsletters about the various policy responses to the coronavirus outbreak, including our latest product, Documenting America's Path to Recovery. This newsletter tracks and analyzes the plans for recovery that have been put forth by states, by localities, and others. And you can find links to all of our newsletters, and that one in particular, obviously, right on our homepage. To stay on top of the political news more broadly, we invite you to subscribe to any of our email newsletters, including the Daily Brew, which comes out every weekday, and our weekly newsletter, The Tap. So thank you very much for watching, everyone. Have a great day.